Thank you, Ramona. Whoa, maybe we can, either I can talk really quiet, or maybe we can turn it down a wee bit. There we go. Yes, indeed, it's lovely to be back here with you. Thank you for that nice welcome and introduction. And it's good to be with you again this summer, actually for 2 Sundays, today and next Sunday as well. Now, to be truthful, since last summer, I actually retired from CBM, but they gave me this really glamorous title of Senior Associate for Strategic Initiatives, and they said, well, stick around and help us out where they think I can be helpful. I hope I am, from time to time. It's great to be here. I do bring you the warm greetings of your partners in mission in Lebanon. I know your church is very generous in its support for the work in Lebanon, and for Joe Breedy, our national field staff there, and we're grateful for everything that you do. And frankly, I'm both impressed and intimidated and really pleased to know that you're part of Active in Mission this year. There's actually churches all across Canada that have gotten on board this year, where for the first time in the history of Active in Mission, our summer fundraising campaign, part of the proceeds are going to food security here in Canada and the needs that we face in Canada, as well as food security concerns internationally. So well done. I hope that you're able to, what does it say in the Bible? Abundantly exceed your ambitious goal of raising $2,000. I'm quite sure you'll be able to do it. This Sunday and next Sunday, I have chosen the theme for my message of crossing over. We're going to have an Old Testament story of crossing over this Sunday, and next Sunday will be a New Testament. But I've chosen this because of the very impressive and extensive work the leadership of your church and the whole congregation has done in your Road to Renewal, which I've read and I am really struck by. It is so awesome to see how over the last, couple of years, you as a congregation got on board in this process. I think I read in an email, probably from you, Ramona, that over 93% of the congregation became part of kind of listening and interaction process for the Road to Renewal, and I'm so excited by that. And it seems that it has brought about clarity in terms of your vision and your mission and your understanding of who you are and who you are called to be as God's people in this place. And now a pastoral search committee is at work and ready to interview, ready to read about and interview, and eventually call a new minister to this church. So a new strategic orientation, clarity around your vision, potentially new leadership coming down the line. It sounds to me that Kingsway Baptist Church is just about ready for takeoff. It's just about ready for crossing over. Now, I need you to put this real world image somewhere in your brain and come back to it again next week. I'm going to explain it to you. My son-in-law, Marshall, is a pilot. I don't know if there's any pilots here in our congregation or listening to us online, but let me tell you what Marshall described for me when an airplane is preparing for takeoff. So it's all of the typical stuff that we would well imagine a pilot would do. She or he would read the weather charts. They would prepare a flight plan and register that flight plan. They would check the airplane. They would go through all of the routines of inspection. Then they would tuck themselves into the cockpit, into the seat of the plane, start the engines, scan or read all of the instruments. They would set the compass and the altimeter. They would test the flaps of the plane. And then they would be called to be ready for takeoff. And the pilot would start pushing on the yoke and the throttle, and the plane would position itself out into the runway. And the tower will tell the pilot, you are now clear for takeoff. And the pilot would start accelerating down the runway. If at any point the pilot detects an alarm or a faulty gauge, or perhaps sees an obstacle on the runway, she or he can choose to abort that takeoff and return back to the gate. But at a certain critical moment, after full throttle, when the right optimal wind speed is coming over the wings, the plane achieves what is called V1. Now, I didn't know anything about this until Marshall explained it to me. But a plane reaches V1, and V1 is that critical maximum speed at which a rejected takeoff or an aborted takeoff is no longer possible. Once you have crossed V1, you are going too fast and there's too much wind coming over the wings and you don't have enough runway to abort takeoff. If there's a problem beyond V1, you're going to have to solve that problem in the air. So Marshall explained to me how important watching for V1 truly is. It is that safety speed when you know that you can now take off. You can cross over the line. Now, as I said, I want you to sit with that image today, and I'll remind you what V1 is if you need to. It's that point of crossing over where you cannot go back. You have committed yourself. And I want you to sit with that today and again next Sunday. Our scripture passage is Joshua chapter 3. We saw it on the screen a minute ago. And I'm going to read Joshua chapter 3, but first I'm going to give you a 1.5-minute summary of the first 5 books of the Bible, if that's okay. Because you need it to get the context for what's happening in Joshua chapter 3. In the first 5 books of the Bible, after God has created the heavens and the earth and all of that kind of stuff, God chooses a man, Abraham, and a family, Abraham's family. And he says to that family, you will become a great nation. You will become the nation of Israel. And lo and behold, they become enslaved in Egypt. Probably not what they thought was going to happen. And while they were in Egypt, enslaved in Egypt, God picks another man, Moses, to lead the people out of Egypt and into what will be the promised land that he has promised earlier to Abraham. Moses takes all of the people, thousands of people who had been enslaved there, and he leads them to the shore of the Red Sea. And there God delivers them from the oppressors in Egypt. The Red Sea opens up and they cross over the Red Sea on dry ground and reach the other side. And then as the Egyptian soldiers chase after them, we all know the story from Sunday school, don't we? The waters close in on the Egyptians and they perish, whereas the Israelites are on dry land on the other side. They have crossed over into safety. And they head off on what was supposed to be a very easy 40-day journey to the promised land. But lo and behold, they falter in their obedience to God. And God calls Moses up onto Mount Sinai, and he gives Moses 10 commandments on 2 tablets of stone. And he says, tell the people to obey this law, and I will make a covenant with you and with all of your descendants that if they be my people and I will be their God, I will lead them on. But the people, when Moses comes back, the people have built an idol. They say, we'd rather go back to Egypt. We want to go back. Life was better when we weren't out here. And God punishes them and he says, none of these rebellious leaders will be able to see the promised land. And so for 40 years, instead of 40 days, the people head off into the desert. And they wander around the desert for 40 long years. But God, and soon, eventually Moses passes on, but Moses calls a successor himself, and he calls a man named Joshua. And Joshua leads the people right to the shore of the Jordan River. And we're going to read this part of this story, but before he goes into the promised land, he sends in spies into the promised land. And they come back and they say, this is an amazing place. We can take this. Now, granted, there are fortified cities over there, and there are mighty warriors. But if God is with us, we will take this land, and it flows with milk and honey, which must have sounded awfully good after eating wafers or manna for 40 years. You know, for 9 to 10 months of the year, the Jordan River is it still is, this very pretty, quaint, quiet little stream. At its narrowest point, it's only 11 yards long, 11 meters wide. But during the rainy season, what was called the spring harvest season, it becomes a torrential waterway, impossible for people to cross. And that's what happens in Joshua chapter 3. So now we will read the passage that I believe will be up on your screen. And I'm reading from the New Revised Standard Version. Early in the morning, Joshua arose and set out from Shittim with all the Israelites, and they came to the Jordan. They camped there before crossing over. At the end of 3 days, the officers went through the camp and commanded the people, "When you see the ark of the covenant of the Lord your God being carried by the Levitical priests, then you shall set out from your place. Follow it, so that you may know the way you should go, for you have not passed this way before. Yet there shall be a space between you and it, a distance of about 2,000 cubits. Do not come any nearer to it." Then Joshua said to the people, "Sanctify yourselves, for tomorrow the Lord will do wonders among you." To the priests, Joshua said, "Take up the ark of the covenant and pass on in front of the people." So they took up the ark of the covenant and went in front of the people. The Lord said to Joshua, "This day I will begin to exalt you in the sight of all Israel, so that they may know that I will be with you, as I was with Moses. You are the one who shall command the priests who bear the ark of the covenant. When you come to the edge of the waters of the Jordan, you shall stand still in the Jordan." Joshua then said to the Israelites, "Draw near and hear the words..." I'm sorry, I just lost my place. "Hear the words of the Lord your God." And Joshua said, "By this you shall know that among you is the living God, who without fail will drive out from before you the Canaanites and Hittites, the Hivites, Perizzites, the Girgashites, and Amorites and Jebusites. The ark of the covenant of the Lord of all the earth is going to pass before you into the Jordan. So now select 12 men from the tribes of Israel, one from each tribe. When the soles of the feet of the priests who bear the ark of the Lord of all the earth, comes to rest in the waters of the Jordan, the waters of the Jordan flowing from above shall be cut off, and they shall stand in a single heap. When the people set out from their tents to cross the Jordan, the priests bearing the ark of the covenant went in front of the people. Now the Jordan overflows all its banks through the times of the harvest. So when those who bore the ark had come to the Jordan, and the feet of the priests bearing the ark were dipped in the edge of the waters flowing from above stood still, rising up in a single heap far off at Adam, the city that was beside Zarethan. While those flowing towards the Sea of Arabah, the Dead Sea, were wholly cut off. Then the people crossed over opposite Jericho. While all Israel was crossing over on dry ground, the priests who bore the ark of the covenant of the Lord stood firmly on dry ground in the middle of the Jordan until the entire nation finished crossing over the Jordan. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. This is V1. This is that crossing over principle, and it finds an arresting illustration in the lives of God's Old Testament people. When God calls people to cross over, they need a certain indication of his leadership, of God's leadership. And so in this passage, he says, when you see the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord your God and the priests and the Levites bearing it, you shall set out from your place and go after it and follow the Ark. So the 12 Hebrew nations had been camping on the far side of the Jordan for maybe months, certainly the last few days. They were right near the shore of the Jordan. Thousands of people had to prepare themselves to plunge into this overflowing river. And they were required a singular certainty that God had gone before them, that God would go before them. These had been desert wandering slaves. They knew nothing about crossing flooded rivers. That was not part of their last 40-year agenda. They had never been this way before. And I think verse 4 is the key verse in this chapter. Maybe in the whole book of Joshua. Verse 4 says this: "Follow the ark of the covenant so that you may know the way you should go, for you have not passed this way before." There's probably no biblical image that has kind of captured a generation as much as the image of the Ark of the Covenant. Thanks to Harrison Ford and Raiders of the Lost Ark Indiana Jones. More recently, real-life treasure hunters and searchers have tried to trace the destiny of the Ark of the Covenant, and many people suspect it's stashed away in some desert in northern Ethiopia somewhere, or southern Egypt. What is it that accounts for people's fascination with that ancient biblical object? The Ark stood for God's presence, the leadership of Yahweh over the nation of Israel. The origin of the Ark goes back to that moment when Moses is shrouded in a cloud on the top of Mount Sinai, and God speaks to him. A secular world that knows nothing about the history of the Old Testament understood that there is some fascination with that gold-encrusted box. But for the people of Israel, the Ark wasn't some magical totem. Its leadership truly belonged to the God and to the people who were willing to move forward by faith. Fortunately, I would say, we are no longer obliged to follow a gold enshrined box when we move forward. We have God's Word as our guide. We have that invisible but nonetheless real presence of the Holy Spirit who inspires us and leads us and directs us into new realities, and should, as a result, give us a much greater sense of God's guidance in our life. So your congregation has been on a journey. You actually called it the road to renewal. You understood that there is a journey that is happening. It's taking you somewhere. It probably began quietly, maybe inwardly, with just a small handful of your leaders and of people in this church, but it has grown outwardly, and it's gained traction, and it's now been written up and articulated so that people of every age and of every category, of every stage in the life of this church can buy into it. You've organized yourselves, you've prayed, you've given testimony about what God has been doing. You've had meetings and small groups, and you've exchanged God knows how many emails probably about this thing. And you've preached about it, and you are on this road. And there's a growing sense of anticipation about what God is doing. And it feels to me that you are reaching that V1 moment. It feels to me, from what I can understand, that this is the moment when the crossing over, maybe it's already happened or it's about to happen. My wife and I visited the Cotswolds in England a few years ago, and we went to a rather fascinating town called Broadway. Nothing like the Broadway in New York. Broadway is just this charming Cotswold village in England. But out in the field, just beyond the town of Broadway, stands a marvelous tower, giant tower. It's on the top of a rather barren-looking hill. Well, that tower, the Tower of Broadway, was built as sort of the first part of a great fortified gate or wall, stone wall, that was going to encircle the whole village. And they began by building the tower and never got around to building the wall. You see, the tower ends up just becoming a monument to sort of the folly of a plan that was never carried through. And people go and see the monument and think, well, that's a rather fascinating tower. What is it for? And they discover that the rest of the plan never came to fruition. And yet, church history is full of stories of people who made a commitment and crossed over and achieved great things for God. I think of Martin Luther, the great reformer, the father of the Protestant Reformation, who stood up against the Catholic Church and decried the wrongs of the Catholic Church. And he was excommunicated by the Catholic Church, and he was made persona non grata in the Holy Roman Empire. His leadership pushed him, led him to reject the false teachings of the time. And that critical moment, the crossing over for Martin Luther, was when he nailed those theses to the door of the church in Wittenberg. He took a stand and he crossed over. Or John Wesley, the Methodist, the founder of the Methodist movement of the Methodist churches. He said in his autobiography that he felt a strange warmth in his heart from actually reading the introduction to the commentary of Romans written by Martin Luther while he was at a meeting at Aldersgate Community Church in London. He was so moved with the certainty of the gospel that he shook all of England and became the father of the evangelical awakening that swept across England and the English-speaking world. In Billy Graham's autobiography, he tells a story about being troubled by his calling, not knowing what God wanted him to do. And he chose, I don't know why, but he said it, he chose to spend the night in prayer on the fairway of a golf course of all places. And there he prayed that God would direct him. And in the morning he woke up certain of his calling. And he walked away from being a pastor of a local church, and he became an itinerant preacher and probably the greatest evangelist of all time. One of my heroes is a Baptist pastor here in Canada named Tommy Douglas. Probably one of the most famous of all famous Canadians, and it's not because of his son Donald Sutherland or his grandson Kiefer Sutherland. It's because of what he stood for. Born in Saskatchewan, he went to Bible school at Brandon Bible College, and then he went to Weyburn, Saskatchewan, where he became a Baptist pastor. And Tommy Douglas began to read and study the work of the social gospel movement that was sweeping across churches in the United States. And he became an ardent champion, a beacon for justice and generosity and fairness. I didn't know this until I read about Tommy Douglas, that his leg was supposed to be amputated because of a severe disease and infection. And a young doctor said to him, "Listen, Mr. Douglas, Reverend Douglas, if you allow me to operate on your leg, if you allow me to operate and use you as a teaching lesson for younger doctors, I won't charge you for the medical care." And the doctor, this young doctor, against the wisdom of all the older doctors, operated on Tommy Douglas for free, sparing him the amputation of his leg. And as a result, Tommy Douglas decided to make a commitment to the cause of universal health care, the first Canadian to do so. And he said nobody's health care should depend on whether or not they have enough money. Universal health care for everyone. And he became the champion of that cause. He went on and ran for public office. He became the leader of the New Democratic Party in Canada. He became the premier of Saskatchewan and then a long-standing member of the opposition in Ottawa. He ended his professional political career as a member of the Privy Council for the opposition party. But he stood for something, and he crossed over that point, and he did it because of his faith. Your crossings over here at Kingsway may not feel anywhere near as dramatic as the crossings over I just mentioned. And yet, nonetheless, you've undertaken a time of preparation. You've come to a certain point. Maybe you are now, as a church, standing on the shore of your own Jordan River, and decisions are being made. There's a very odd Hebrew word in this passage in Joshua chapter 3. The Hebrew word is habar, and it refers to this idea of crossing over. You see, habar refers to the fact that a divide, a gap, exists. And that gap has to be bridged. It has to be crossed over. For the nation of Israel, in Joshua chapter 3, it was the Jordan River. But it could refer to any gulf that needs to be crossed. And habar literally means to join together. And the question that we face ourselves, that faces us today is, are we able to join together to cross over that which separates? Are we able to take a step of faith and believe that God has gone before us? None of us knows what's on the other side when we take that step. We don't know what lies out there. It's the case for a church. It's the case for people individually. We don't know what's going to happen in personal lives, and your church has gone through the horrible tragedy of losing Nathan McCoy recently. There's always crossings over, aren't there? Marriages are a time of crossing over, but so are breakups in relationships. The birth of a child or a grandchild is a crossing over. The death of a loved one. New careers are crossings over. Retirement is a type of crossing over. Changing jobs, moving neighborhoods, moving across the country, whatever God calls us to do, starting in a new school or graduating from school, moving away from home, or for some, moving back home with your parents. These are all times when we cross over lines that we don't quite know what lies out there, but we step out in faith. I read a fascinating story written by a rather wealthy industrialist who was nostalgically reminiscing about his own childhood and growing up on a family farm. And his chore every evening was to go out to the barn at night and close the barn door to secure the farm animals before the family went to bed. But like most children, he dreaded what lurked in the dark, what could threaten him at night and in the shadows on the way to that distant barn. And his father taught him an unforgettable lesson. So standing on the porch of the farmhouse, his father took a lantern from the house and handed it to him and said, "What do you see?" And the boy holding up the lantern said, "I can see the yard gate and I can't see any further." And the father said, "Go with the lantern to the yard gate and tell me what you see." And so he went to the yard gate, and now the lantern cast its light all the way to the corral fence, but no further. And the father said, "When you get to the corral fence, tell me what you see." And the boy got to the corral fence, and he yelled back to his father and said, "I see the windmill." And the father said, "Then go to the windmill and tell me what you see." And the boy went to the windmill, and he said, "The light casts its way all the way to the barn door." And the father said, then go to the barn door and shut the door." You see, the light was able to show the way only a certain distance. But when he got there, he was able to go further to the next point of need. And in Joshua chapter 3, we have read that the Hebrews were willing to wait on the Lord until the light began to shine for them to when they would be willing to cross over the Jordan. They had to begin by waiting. And after they had waited, the next step for them was to be willing to follow the Lord unconditionally, to step out into the river. And I hope you noticed what really strikes me is that 40 years earlier when they crossed the Red Sea, they stood on dry ground, and 40 years later when they crossed the Jordan, the priests had to put their feet in the river. They had to step out into the water before God opened it up. They had to believe that they could follow God unconditionally. And thirdly, they had to be willing to consecrate themselves to God. The only way to go forward is in faith. You only go as far as the light is able to show the path for you. You step out and you say, "We are ready to cross over. We cannot see all the way." Just as the Israelites could not see all of the battles that lay ahead and all of the fortified cities that they had to conquer, but they knew that they had to cross over the Jordan. And the ark would go before them and show them the way. So where are you as a church today? Where are you on the runway? Or have you already taken off? Are you still checking the instruments of the church and making sure that things are ready? Or are you contemplating now that it's time to give it a little more acceleration as you approach that V1? Are you ready for takeoff as a church? Are you ready to cross over? Next week, we're going to be looking at a New Testament story, and we're going to understand how God calls the church to cross over, in fact, many frontiers in order to be the people that He has called them to be. Thanks be to God. Amen.